The Story Without a Name by Barbey Chapter 6. When Lasthany recovered consciousness, her mother was lying on the floor, her face glued to the crucifix. The movement the girl made, the moan which she uttered in coming to, aroused the mother from her prostration, and drawing herself up to full height, she towered over her daughter, her forehead still bleeding. "You shall tell me all," she declared imperiously. "I insist on knowing. Tell me at once, to whom in this solitude where we live like recluses, and where there is not a man of your station, to whom have you given yourself?" Again Lasthany moaned, yet too weak to answer. She stared haggardly, with the stupidity of astonishment. "There! I've had enough of your comedy, enough of your silence, enough of your lies. Don't pretend that you don't understand me, for you do," continued the mother, who was no longer a mother but a judge, and a judge prepared to become an executioner. Insulted in her modesty and innocence, revolting at so much cruelty and blind injustice, the poor girl sobbed. "Mother," she implored, "what is it you wish me to say? What are you angry at? What have I done? I don't understand at all what you mean, except that there's something dreadful. You're killing me. I shall lose my senses, and with your horrible expressions and your bleeding forehead, you seem to have lost them yourself." Violently, with the back of her hand, Madame de Frejol wiped her forehead. "Let it bleed," she interrupted. "If it bleeds, it is for you, ungrateful child. But don't tell me you don't understand. It's a lie. You know well enough what is the matter with you. All women do. Merely on seeing each other they know. I'm not a bit surprised that you refused to confess the other night." At last, the enervated girl grasped the full portent and infamy of the accusation. "Mother," she moaned, "you know I'm not. What you say is impossible. I'm ill. I'm suffering. But my illness is not caused by the horrible thing you imagine. I see no one but you and Agatha. I never leave you." "You go walk alone on the mountain," Madame de Frejol, with a look of atrocious penetration, insinuated. In the degradation of such a suspicion, Lasthany clasped her hands. "Mother, you kill me. Angels of heaven, be merciful to me. You at least know what I am." "Don't invoke the angels. You've driven them away. They no longer hear you," said Madame de Frejol, blindly incredulous of the innocence which proclaimed itself with such despairing candor. Continuing more violently than before, "Don't add sacrilege to your falsehood," she cried, and brutally added, "You are lost. You are dishonored. Deny it or not, it is the same in the end. You are dishonored. You are lost. But by whom? Tell me at once who it is. Who is it? Who is it?" she repeated, and seized the child by the shoulder, and shook her so cruelly that she threw her back on the pillow. There the poor child lay, whiter than the pillow itself. She had fainted again, but Madame de Frejol was as unmoved by the second swoon as the first. She had asked God's forgiveness for her daughter's sin and her own lack of vigilance, and in her anger was capable of trampling the girl under her feet. Seated at the bedside of the child, whom twice she had turned into a corpse, she let her recover her senses as best she might. The pride which religion had not conquered rebelled in her heart at the insupportable idea that a man, an unknown, one of the lower classes no doubt, had clandestinely dishonored her daughter. The name of that man she wanted. When Lasthany opened her eyes, she saw her mother bending over her, as though she was seeking that name on her lips. "His name! His name!" she called, her eyes flashing with a devouring glare. "Ah, hypocrite! I'll tear that accursed name from you if I have to dig it, child, from your entrails." But Lasthany, overwhelmed by all the abominations of the night, instead of answering her mother, gazed at her through two big, empty eyes that seemed to be dead. And they were dead, those beautiful eyes, and so remained forever without a glimmer through the tears of which they shed torrents. Madame de Frejol learned nothing from her daughter that night, nor did she learn anything from her later on. But it was with that night for a starting point that they entered into the infernal life which thereafter they led, one that is without parallel in the somberest situations of tragedy. From that time it became really a story without a name, a drama, suffocating and suffocated, between two women of the same blood, who loved each other nevertheless, who had never been separated, but of whom, in the bonds of confidence, one had never been a mother, nor the other a child. It was a drama soul to soul, deep-reaching, prolonged, mysterious, one in which the mystery had to be increased that Agatha might not know of the ignominy which Madame de Ferjol was more anxious even than her daughter to hide. For at that time Lastiny did not believe what her mother had said. In the novelty of her sensations, she thought herself attacked by some unfamiliar complaint, that her symptoms were deceptive, that the error of her mother was monstrous, a thing to be rebelled against. Yet, as she writhed beneath the insult, the dishonoring blow did not make her bend the head. Hers was the sublime obstinacy of innocence. And because she did not resemble her mother, who in her place would have roared like a lioness, she said to her with the gentleness of a lamb that lets his throat be cut, "Some day how sorry you will be to have made me suffer so." But that day of which she spoke never came. Yet were the days that came to that pitiless mother who would not forgive, who never spoke of forgiveness, and to that girl who staked her honor on remaining unforgiven. The days passed, long, despairful, black. Only there was one more despairful than the others, one that Lastiny had not expected, one in which the interior shiver of the child, announcing its life, told her that it was she and not her mother who was wrong. They were sitting, as usual, in front of each other in the embrasure of the window, devoured equally by the same dumb pain, their feverish hands at work. A ray of sun entered like a wind through the hole, that hole above them which the peaks of the mountains made, and in that gloomy room dropped on their necks a guillotine of light. Suddenly, with an involuntary cry, Lastiny put her hand to her side. At the cry, and still more at the sight of the inexpressible desolation which swept over her face, already profoundly disconsolate, her mother, who seemed to read it through her, instantly understood. "You felt it, didn't you?" she hissed. "You are sure at last. You won't say no to me any more, that stupid no of yours. It's here, isn't it?" And she placed her hand where Lastiny had her own. "But who put it here? Tell me. I insist." With the eternal question once more she stabbed her daughter, and the latter, overcome now as with a lightning stroke by the sudden revelation which showed her mother to be right, unfortunately undone by the certainty of her misfortune, shook her head wildly, and answered that she did not know, an inexcusable reply that angered her mother as nothing had angered her before. Thus far, Madame de Ferjol had imagined it was shame that sealed her daughter's lips. But the shame had been drunk. There was no motive now for further concealment. "If you won't tell me," she announced measuredly, "it is because there's something more shameful than your own shamelessness. Your shame of the man who gave you yourself." The suspicion that had come to her before concerning the Capuchin returned, not as it had to Agatha, who believed in spells, but as it might to a woman like herself, who believed in the sorceries of love, and who had been a victim of them. But that suspicion of a crime which to her was the greatest of all, since a priest was the culprit, she put from her, but more out of respect for the character of the man of God than through any faith in the innocence of her daughter. Her own experience had taught her what a fragile thing virtue is. Yet, afraid in her frightened anxiety to utter the suspicion that tortured her, she began again, with the eternal questions, to massacre the despairful girl, already half killed by her incomprehensible condition. But in vain. Lastiny made no more answer than that of silence and tears. Madame de Ferjol was not a woman to be disarmed or outwearied. Lastiny's silence and tireless tears were interrupted by the indefatigable blows of questioning. Whether they were alone, the torture recommenced, and at present they were almost always alone. Their lifelong tete-a-tete became more absolute than it had ever been. The emptiness of their great house, and the jostling mountains, seemed to unite in an effort to bring them into stricter intimacy than before. Formerly, when Agatha had finished her work, she joined the ladies de Ferjol in the room where they passed the monotonous routine of their existence. There she sat and knitted. But since Madame de Ferjol had learned the secret of Lastiny's disorder, she used the first pretext that came to her to keep Agatha out of the way. She feared her keen eyes, and she feared too the tears that her daughters could not staunch, and which flowed hour-long on her hands as she worked. "For shame's sake," she admonished her once when the servant was not present, "don't cry before Agatha. You're able to hold your tongue, you should be able to contain yourself. For all your dainty airs, you're strong enough. Your health may be poor, but vice has given you strength. I'm only your mother. Your sin I share, since I could not prevent you from committing it. But Agatha is a respectful woman, and if she is merely suspected what I knew, she would despise you." On that point she insisted constantly, and made use of the servant's scorn not only to humiliate Lasthany still more, but through its repetition to force the girl to tell the name which she would not give. Madame de Fragile was well versed in invective, and, were it possible, it would have gladdened her to find something lower than a servant's contempt to hurl at her daughter's face. Agatha adored Lasthany, and had the hideous truth been told her, there would have been no scorn in her heart. Scorn to the proud is what pity is to the lowly, and Agatha's soul was a tenderness that years had not altered. Lasthany was well aware of that. "Agatha is not like my mother," she told herself. "She would not despise me. She would not reproach me. She would pity me." And in the misfortune that overwhelmed her, time and again, she longed to throw herself in the arms of one who had been her nurse, the confidant of her childhood griefs. But her mother prevented her. Madame de Fragile's ascendancy over her daughter had always been irresistible, but latterly it had become terrifying. When Agatha was present, she Medusa'd the girl with her eyes. And as for Agatha, when she looked over her spectacles at the two women who, in their silent desolation, sat facing each other, needle in hand, she did not dare utter a word. Her opinion had not changed, but since Madame de Fragile had shrugged her shoulders at it, she kept it to herself. By way of explanation of the pallor, the fainting fits, the tears of the girl, whom the mother said was nervous, Madame de Fragile had invented a complaint of which the local physician, in his ignorance, understood nothing, but for which she had prescriptions sent to her from Paris. It was easier, after all, to keep Lasthany out of the way of a physician, who would have known what was the matter the moment he looked at her, than to separate her from Agatha. But then, she reflected, was it possible to conceal Lasthany's condition much longer? It was terrible enough as it was, but would not the symptoms become presently so marked that even Agatha, whose innocence made her blind, would see them? Madame de Fragile thought of these things, of others as well, and for the moment she wondered whether it might not be better to suppress Agatha, and, despite her affection and devotion, send her back to Normandy. In that event, the very fact of dismissing Agatha would relieve her of any outward need of another servant. The neighbors were respectful indeed, but they were inquisitive and malicious. Once guarded against the gossip, she and her daughters could live alone in the servantless house like two souls in some pit of hell. That was her perspective. But the horrible problem that she constantly prepondered was how she was to act later on. As yet she could form no decision, though she could never ask now to speak to her daughter, except to ask the eternal question which still remained unanswered. She too shrank from an avowal that dishonored the name that she bore so proudly, and to herself she kept repeating, "What shall I do? What shall I do?" Day in, day out, every moment, even while she prayed, Madame de Fragile put to herself that question. She thought of it in church, before the tabernacle, before the communion table which she had forsaken. Jansenist that she was, she believed that since her child's sin had ceased to be worthy to approach it. At all times and places, she was the prey and the problem of the uncertainty which was eating her life. Her anxiety was such that it made her head swim, and that anxiety, joined to the inconsolable grief of her daughter's fall, made her treat the latter with an anger and a resentment that were well nigh ferocious. Yet still the greater sufferer was Lasthany. Madame de Fragile was certainly most miserable. She suffered in her motherly and womanly pride, in her conscience, and even in her strength, for which we pay atrociously high. For the psychologically strong have neither the relief nor the sedative of tears. Their sobs are suffocated. Nevertheless she was a mother, injured and insulted, and Lasthany was but her daughter, the object of her eternal reproach, the victim who she crushed with the now undeniable evidence of the sin which she had called a crime. In the abominable intimacy that existed between them, surely then it was Lasthany who suffered most. In unhappiness, there is a moment similar to that which comes in happiness, when there is no longer a possible chronicle, when that which is untellable is left to the imagination to divine. To Lasthany, that moment had come. She was unrecognizably changed, to such a degree that those who had thought her charming would have never believed that this was what was left of the fair Mademoiselle de Ferjol. She frightened, all lily of the valley that she was. The Rosalind of Shakespeare had gone, and with her the pallor that she had, which is the beauty of tender hearts. She was but a sallow mummy, a strange mummy too, one that continually wept, and whose flesh, instead of withering, grew softer, bruised, and rotted with tears. She suffered horribly, and it was pitiful to see her drag her weighed waist about. She would have hid it perpetually in the floating folds of her peignoir, but that her mother would not permit. She forced her to church, thinking no doubt that its influence would do her good, and that it would be a benefit to her wicked heart, to force from it perhaps the secret that it held. "You are not ill enough yet," she would say with scornful severity. "In God's holy house you must ask his forgiveness." To take her there, it was she who dressed her, not Agatha. It was she who, as they left the house, wrapped her daughter's head in a thick veil to hide what she had seen. A veil so thick that the girl might have been smothered in it, a veil that would have concealed leprosy itself. But it was not the face alone that had to be concealed. There was the waist, which would have told the story to the least observing, and to prevent that, she laced Lasthany's corset herself, tightly, so that it hurt. Sometimes, under the pressure of her mother's hand, involuntarily the girl would groan, whereat the mother, exasperated at the obstinate silence which withheld the name, would hiss in her ear that this sin must suffer. "Perhaps you're afraid I will kill it," she said once, when the girl seemed to be suffering from the lacing more than before. "You needn't. The children of crime are strong."